Jesus went out beside the lake again. The whole crowd came to him, and he began to teach them. As he continued along, he saw Levi sitting at a kiosk for collecting taxes. And Jesus said to him, "Follow me." And Levi got up, and he followed him. And Jesus sat down to eat at Levi's house. And many tax collectors and sinners were eating with Jesus and his disciples. Indeed, many of them had become his followers. When some of the legal experts from amongst the Pharisees saw that he was eating with sinners and tax collectors, they asked his disciples, "Why is he eating with sinners and tax collectors?" And when Jesus heard it, he said to them, "Healthy people don't need a doctor. Sick people do. I didn't come to call righteous people, but sinners." The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. You may be seated. Have you ever been to a Korean day spa? Okay, I have a lot of friends who swear by them, and they seem like kind of an ordeal. They're like the size of Home Depots, and they have all these different spa rooms or whatever. I have a lot of clergy friends who use them. When my girlfriends talk about self-care, they also talk about like massages and pedicures and spa days, but I don't like massages at all, and I never have, and I really don't like saunas. And pedicures always look nice, but I hate that part. I don't know if you've ever gotten a pedicure, but they scrub the bottom of your feet with those scrubber things, and I am very ticklish. And I am always afraid I'm going to jerk my foot and accidentally kick somebody in the face while they do that part, so I don't get pedicures very often. And so many of the self-care discussions that we have in these days center around ideas of like relaxation and pampering. And that's probably why I don't connect with them very well, because relaxing is not hard for me. Never has been. I have never been that person who overworks themselves. I am so ready to take my vacation, and I don't call anybody when I'm gone. Self-care for me instead has always been about introspection. And I really only learned to do that effectively in therapy. And the years I spent in therapy helped me in a way that massages and saunas and relaxation never did, because they helped me come to grips with who I was and what my limits were, and the unhealed places of brokenness I had and would probably always have. But those weren't necessarily surprises to me as a concept, because I grew up in church. And if there's something the church has always been good at telling us, it's about ourselves and the world and how they aren't the way they should be. For the last month or so, we've been focusing on this spiritual discipline of worship, what worship isn't, and how we're supposed to prepare for it, and how we bring even our negative emotions into it. And I think I've made it fairly clear that as Christians, we believe that worship has to center around God. But it hasn't escaped me that this is an odd thing we do on Sunday, because God doesn't need us to do any of it. God doesn't have an ego that we have to stroke on Sunday mornings. God knows who God is, whether we acknowledge God, and God will ultimately get what God wants, whether or not we bumblingly interfere with God. So if God doesn't need it, but we're still called into it over and over and over again, all throughout the Old Testament and all throughout the New Testament, we have to ask the question of, what's this for? And it's for us. Worship has always been for us, because we need it. Because it's worship, regular worship, that reorients us around who God is. Worship reminds us about what is real in the world and what is not. And worship reminds us about what we're supposed to be doing every day. But what's real, right? What do we forget when we're not in worship? What do we forget when we're not coming to church? What do we forget when we fail to center God right in the middle of our lives? Jesus said it pretty brutally to those Pharisees. Healthy people don't need a doctor. Sick people do. And I didn't come to call righteous people. Joseph Babinski was a neurologist in Paris in the early 20th century, like pre-World War I. And he was used to seeing all the odd things you see when you're a neurologist. But around 1914, he encountered two patients who've kind of changed psychiatry since then. They both had damage to the right hemispheres of their brains, so they were paralyzed on their left sides. But the odd thing about the patients was that they insisted they were absolutely normal. They were both completely unaware that anything was wrong with them. He would explain their needs and their treatments, and once he recommended electrotherapy to one of the patients, and she said, "Why do you want to electrify me? I am not paralyzed," even though she was visibly paralyzed. He coined a new word to describe the symptom that we still use today, anosognosia, anosognosia. Literally means without knowledge. Babinski believed that his patients were not lying, and they weren't confused. They genuinely had no concept that half of their body was paralyzed. They didn't know they weren't well. In our scripture reading this morning, Jesus is having a meal with people who seem to be having a spiritual form of that. At dinner are tax collectors and broadly named sinners. Who knows what that means? It could mean a bunch of things, but they're probably the fun people you invite to your parties. And this seems to be really perplexing to the Pharisees, who are also there, who are not brave enough to talk to Jesus, so they talk about Jesus to his disciples. And then they're asking a fair question. If Jesus is the Son of Man, the God's own Son, like his followers all claim he is, why is he spending his time with powerless people and contemptible people? It seems like the Pharisees don't believe that there's much in common between them and those tax collectors, like they wouldn't categorize themselves as sinners at all. But Jesus is pretty blunt in a way that he's not usually blunt, so I appreciate it. He basically says, why do you think the Messiah came? Because everything's going so great for everybody? No, God shows up in the middle of you because you need God. You are sick. You are all sick. And you don't know it. And I am here for healing. We don't live in a world where Jesus is wandering around offering spiritual and physical healing, unfortunately, so we go to church instead, because that's the closest we get. We go to worship because worship puts us in proximity to God, who is whole and well. And it's really only in the presence of the one who is wholly holy do we realize how fragmented and sick we have become. When we hear about God's love, we suddenly realize how chained we've become to hate. When we hear about how we are intended to be a single body of believers, we cannot help but recognize how much distrust and disunity has pervaded all of our relationships. In this way, worship sometimes feels like a doctor's office where we are receiving a diagnosis. But unlike those moments, worship doesn't stop at a diagnosis. It's not all morose. It's not all naming sin. Worship always moves beyond diagnosis and into treatment. Jesus sees us, sees that we are chronically unwell, and moves to save. And that's why we need it. Worship shows us what is real about ourselves. That even though we don't feel like sinners a lot, even though we are sure it's those people out there who are obviously more sinners than we are. What's real is that we are not well. But God is about the business of making us well. The world is not well, but God is about the business of making all creation well. But that wellness requires us to change, and to change we have to learn what we are called to do. But what are we called to do? What have we forgotten when we're not in worship? What have we forgotten when we don't come to church together? What do we forget about what we're supposed to be doing when we're not centering ourselves on God? Again, Jesus shows us pretty clearly when he meets and welcomes a Jewish collaborator with the Romans. Jesus saw Levi, the tax collector, and Jesus said, "You, follow me." And Levi did. In an opinion piece for The Guardian, Julian, this is his real last name, Noisecat. Okay, Julian Noisecat. He detailed his experience of choosing to get arrested in New York City during a protest in 2017 in support of the tribes of Standing Rock. He explained his motivation like this: "I grew up believing that getting arrested for protesting was a rite of passage. As a young man in Oakland, I listened to older generations recount memories of the occupation of Alcatraz, the United Farm Workers' Great Boycott, and the Black freedom struggle. I shared the anger of thousands of Black and brown and indigenous men condemned to cages or gunned down because society thought them less than their white peers. And as I entered the workforce and the electorate in the wealthiest and most powerful nation in the history of the world, these realities felt increasingly outrageous and unacceptable to me. Marching up the street from my day job, I imagined generations of indigenous ancestors at my back, and on that day, we had had enough." Julian reached the point where he knew that to be faithful to what he believed, he had to get up and follow. He had to put his body where his values were. That's what worship reminds us of, ideally. Worship puts us back into proximity to God, who is about the work of justice and the redemption of all creation, and only when we're back in the presence regularly of the just and redeeming one do we realize that we've been called to follow Jesus in that same way, that we are all tax collectors, collaborators with an evil empire, sitting in our booths waiting to be called to follow. In the scripture, when we meet Levi, all we know is he's a tax collector, and this is actually the only time he appears in any of the Gospels. I don't know that the Gospels are very comfortable with him. And we're not sure much about him, whether he was wealthy or poor. They're in Capernaum. That was a big city, a center of commerce. It probably had a large number of merchants bringing in their goods and paying the taxes, and Levi may have been wealthier than the average tax collector, but he was still a tax collector. He was not one of whom the Pharisees thought God would forgive or choose to work with. He was a collaborator. I mean, he'd have to change majorly for God to be interested, right? But as Jesus usually works, Jesus chooses his disciples from the people that we would be like, Jesus, you didn't even vet them. They're going to come up really bad in their background check. Have you even looked at their social media? They're going to embarrass us. Jesus chooses the ones who are least worthy, always. That's how God did it in the Old Testament, too. And the response to Jesus is stunning. It's immediate. Levi immediately says yes and takes Jesus to his home. Now, whatever criticisms we have of the disciples, and they're fair, we cannot fault them for their immediate willingness to do the work of God despite the cost. They meet Jesus out of nowhere. He says, "I'm the Messiah, you should follow me," and they all sign up. They all sign up. somehow, even in the meeting, they are changed by God, and they put their bodies where their values are. In Celebration of Discipline, Quaker minister Richard Foster writes, "One reason worship has to be considered spiritual discipline is because it is an ordered way of acting and living that sets us before God so he can transform us. To stand before the Holy One of all eternity is to change. In worship, an increased power steals its way into the sanctuary of our hearts. Increased compassion grows in our soul. To worship is to change, and in that change, worship enables us to finally hear the call to service clearly, so that we are able, like the disciples, to say, 'Here I am, send me.'" That's why we need worship. Worship tells us the truth about our spiritual and moral condition, and then it moves us into action immediately. Jesus is always ready to go. The world outside us would keep us firmly in our molds, in the status quo, never pushing back or taking risks for the sake of our neighbors or the oppressed. But worship, regular worship, breaks the shackles of the status quo all around us, unites us in relationship with strangers that we would never spend time with otherwise, and changes us irrevocably for the sake of the redemption of creation. Worship makes us maladapted for anything other than service to God. It is the place of transformation. It is the place of transformation, and our transformation ripples out into the communities in which we take part. God needs to heal the world, and the world's healing begins in our worship. Friends, I ask that you would take stock of yourself this week, of your condition, to be truthful about where you are unwell. And all of us are unwell in one place or another. Reveal where you are fragmented, where you are captive to resentment or hatred or despair. In prayer, name those things to God and ask for Christ to heal you. He did not come for those who are well. He came for those who are sick. And then make a commitment to continue to worship. Because in worship, whether it is here or elsewhere, you will hear words of conviction and compassion, of justice and mercy, of love that overcomes hatred, of a God who can change and will heal the hurting soul of the world. In worship, you will learn the story which is the only story. You will hear the truth, and that truth will not only set you free, but it will set you on the path to set your neighbors free too. You will again and again and again, in regular worship, find your life recentered on the God of creation, and in that recentering, you will remember who you are, and you will know what you are called to do.